Welcome back to Digital Tutors. In this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the differences between editing doc and fiction action scenes, primarily focusing on those fictional action scenes. Because yes, a lot of the techniques are the same, a lot of the methods of putting together the story are the same, but you have unique challenges and opportunities with each. Again, the main opportunity that you have when editing together fictional action scenes is hopefully when it was getting filmed, you have lots of coverage of repeated action, as opposed to trying to piece together a story out of the documentary footage, which just kind of happened as it was. In the fiction world, it's scripted, it's choreographed, and you have multiple coverages of the same thing, so you really do have the luxury of crafting together the story from many, many different choices. And again, that's the job of the editor, is to craft together the story, is to stitch together the images and the audio to take your audience through the whole story. So you're always thinking about that. Now, in this scene, again, ridiculous scene, there's not a whole bunch of different coverages. There's a few different choreographies within the greater set of choreography that have 3 or 4 different shots within them. And that's a good starting point. It's not like a lot of scenes where you would actually have, an hour of footage for this entire 2-minute scene, which can be a little bit overwhelming. This is a little bit easier to digest, a little bit easier to jump in, and then you can always up the ante with the next project. So we already have our string out. We talked about the whole point of the string out before, is just to go through and take all of these individual shots and break them down into their components that we may or may not want to use. So the first thing we're going to do is duplicate this string out. So we duplicate it, and we're going to call it our rough cut. And again, that's really important to have that generational editing, because it allows us the opportunity, if we do anything here that we don't like, we can always go back to the string out. When we're done with the rough cut and we do the next set, we can always go back to the rough cut if we've taken a wrong turn, let's say, which does have a tendency to happen as an editor. You try things out, sometimes they don't work. And again, if it's a couple of different steps, you can always just Command or Control Z your way back. But if you've spent an hour down a path and you really went down the rabbit hole and you don't like what's going on, it's much easier to just step back than it is to re-put together what you've already done, and a lot less disheartening. So by doing generational editing, we can chop away to our heart's content and not have to worry too much about overcutting. With our rough cut, we have to figure out how we're going to get into the scene. We have to figure out whose scene it is from the character's perspective and how we want the audience to experience every individual moment. So within this footage, there's a few different parts that we really want to talk about. First is the beginning. You always have to figure out where you're dropping your audience into this story. We can start in this over the shoulder if we want, but we don't get a lot of information about where we are. We don't really get to see a face. It's not very interesting. This is a much better, stronger opening. Or this, because you have a close-up, you actually identify with a person, and then you know who to pay attention to. Now, which one of these we used first will determine whose point of view we're following this scene from. And we can do one of two things. We can either follow the point of view from this guy, who in the end, spoiler alert, is going to get beaten in this particular fight scene, or we can follow the victor. Either one is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It just depends on what the story of the overall film is. This film consists of these 2 scenes. So the only characters in both scenes is this guy with the green hat. And so I would have a tendency to probably start it from his perspective, but you could psychologically make people pay attention to this character first, feel the heartbreak of him getting beaten in the fight, and then move over to the victor of that fight and watch him get, well, not necessarily beaten, because that fight doesn't go all the way to the end. But you see what I'm saying is the psychology of how you set up the scene really prepares your audience. So here's a potential option. You could start with this long shot just so that you can see the entire scene. And again, we can just drag this up here and drag it out if we really want. You have this guy with the flowers, all of that. We could start here. Always just cut things, move it over. Then we could cut in roughly to him. Then go to either of these 2 shots, and we'll just see how this will cut together. So you're letting your audience know where they are. You're paying attention to that guy first. Oh, someone else is here. They stick their head out. We would need to put a shot between this one and this one if we're going to use it, because I really like this shot. It really puts you into the psychology of this character. And then when you see this shot afterwards, it really, sets the bar, sets the stage for the confrontation. So what we have to do is figure out a shot between those two, if this is the way that we're going to put it together. And so we might need this shot. So there's a couple of different ways that we can grab the other part of this because we already cut. We can either go back to the string out, or we can reload this shot by just pressing F and going to another part of it. We can just mark it in and out. We can just drag that down here. Or we could always just click on this one and copy it by going to Edit Copy, or Command or Control C, and then paste it farther down, which is Command or Control V. Now, if you're going to copy and paste, there's one thing that you have to keep in mind. Even though I copy this, which I'm going to do right here, I'm going to copy it. When I paste it, it's going to paste it to where you have this set up. So if I do that, you notice it overwrote and pasted on V1, which is not what I want. What I want is for it to paste onto V2. So what I do is switch this to V2 so that what I'm pasting will only affect V2, paste it, and there we go. So something else to keep in mind if you're going to be copying and pasting a whole bunch. So the beginning is the integral part of the scene. Work on that a little bit, figure it out. Let's just see a couple of other options here. Again, we have a lot of these individual scenes where you couldn't cut from this shot to this shot because that would be a jump cut unless you wanted your audience to feel that cut. You could cut from this one to this one or this one to this one. So basically, I would be picking between these two shots. Do we want the wider coverage of it? Do we want the closer coverage of it? That is a personal choice. How often do we want to get in there? These ridiculous shots here, again, a la Kung Fu movies or old spaghetti westerns, really kind of start teaching you to focus on the characters themselves, as ridiculous as they are. And then when we move down here, again, we have, this is another scene where we have a whole bunch of different coverages. We have the long shot, we have the point of views, we have the over the shoulder. And so it kind of would be a combination of these two. You can craft a little story within the scene. So again, starting off with the long shot and then cutting into these point of views as he punches and then he reacts and then he punches and then he reacts again. And then maybe the last one would be an over the shoulder so we can see a little bit more of the action of the block. And finally, a close-up of the hit. So you can see how somebody was really thinking about this when they were shooting it to give you those options. But those are just some suggestions for you to try. The last thing that I kind of want to talk about is the end. We're going to get to the slow motion shot in another lesson, but you can feel free to use it. You notice that it is in actual slow motion now. We should probably talk about how you can do that really quickly. Get this into slow motion because this was shot at 720 and 60 frames per second. So we can go down to this footage and it is shot 3002. If we go to clip, modify, and interpret footage, you can see that we can use the original frames here, which was 59.9401, which is 60 frames per second in the camera, or we can assume it at 23.98, which is 24 frames a second. That's what everything else has been filmed at. Technically, it's 23.976, but it'll probably just round that back up to 23.98. Press OK, and now, even though this was originally shot in 60, it will be in true slow motion because we shot more frames. So take a look at all of this footage and modify that shot. Make sure you know how that happens. And when you have an actual cut together that flows relatively well, then come on back for the next lesson.